Hello and welcome to a brand new video. Today we're going to discuss the political philosopher and thinker Thomas Hobbes and his social contract theory. He was a 17th century English philosopher who transformed the political world with his radical ideas of absolute sovereignty, the necessity of a strong central authority, and the natural state of mankind as brutish, chaotic, without governance. And this will be a three-part series, and the next part will cover John Locke, and the third part will finish with covering Rousseau. So let's start with a question that Hobbes asked himself. What would life be like without government? It's a condition what he calls the state of nature, and it's a condition where you can do anything you want, and it sounds great until you realize that others have the same privilege as well. So Hobbes argues that that state of nature would lead to a war of all against all, or in Latin, bellum omnium contra omnes, where life is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes says in his book Leviathan that, quote, whatsoever therefore is consequent of a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit therefore is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor the use of commodities that may be ported by the sea, no commodious building, no instrument of moving, and moving things as requires much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and worst of all, continual fear, and the danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So in this state of nature, there would be no pleasure, but only constant fear and the possibility of death. Since this is no condition for people to live, they would be driven by fear to create a social contract. And if you don't know, a social contract is where people agree to relinquish some certain freedoms in exchange for protection and order provided by a sovereign authority or state or government who holds power and enforces laws. And since people are driven by self-interest rather than the greatest good, no one is ever fully satisfied with what they have and are prone to be suspicious of others, and they would constantly want to seek dominance, and conflict becomes inevitable in the absence of a common power. There's a quote from Leviathan again. Thomas Hobbes says, quote, hereby it is manifest that during the time that men live without common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition called war, and such a war is as of every man against every man. For Hobbes, there is no good and evil, there is only our desires and appetites, and we have a restless desire to fulfill them. The ultimate passion, according to Hobbes, is power itself, a, quote, perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. So the quote from Leviathan, so that it is the first place I put for a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceases only in death, and that cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with the moderate power, but he cannot assure that power and means to live well, which he hath present without the acquisition of more. The Hobbes saw humans not as moral agents or divine images, but only as bodies in motion, following their instincts for survival. So while I was on a walk last night, I was thinking about Hobbes and his idea of the state of nature, and it reminded me of the book Lord of the Flies. And in the book, the boys descend into savagery after being on an island, a deserted island, and that kind of mirrors what Hobbes is talking about like how he views people without social order, and people will regress to their primal instincts, driven by fear and hunger and their desire for power. And in the book, the kids start to form a government and ultimately fails. And Hobbes would say that because the boys didn't forfeit all their rights to the central authority. The quote from Leviathan again, Thomas Hobbes says, quote, and because the condition of man is a condition of war, of everyone against everyone, and which is the case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be a help unto him, and preserving his life against his enemies. It followeth that in such a condition every man has right to everything, even to one another's body. Therefore, the sovereign must be absolute in order to avoid civil war amongst the competing people, and individuals can't own property rights or moral claims against the sovereign, and such claims would undermine the authority needed to maintain peace. And the sovereign must have the power to determine what is just, to suppress dissent, and even to regulate speech and public opinion if necessary. And Hobbes is clear that the sovereign's legitimacy comes from the people, the consent of the governed, but once that consent is given, it can't be revoked. So the quote from Leviathan again, he says, quote, I authorize and give up my rights of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition, that thou that give up thy right to him, and authorize all his actions in like manner. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth, and Latin civitas. That this is the generation of that Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. So as people come together and form alliances and renounce their individual rights for the sake of the collective security, and it doesn't matter whether the sovereignty was established by agreement or by conquest, as long as it protects the people, that's what matters. So now the question becomes, what kind of government would Hobbes prefer? And the answer to this would be an absolute monarchy. Separation of powers or limited powers would create the risk of conflict or civil war, and all essential functions, such as making laws, interpreting and enforcing them, or waging war, taxes, and all of this, would be unified under the sovereign, and this also includes religious doctrines. So all these ideas are found within his book Leviathan, and we've quoted it several times throughout this video. And let's talk about the title for a bit. So the title Leviathan refers to a mythical sea monster mentioned in the Bible, particularly in Job 41. So it says, quote, "Nothing on this earth is his equal, a creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is king over all that are proud." So Hobbes is using this terrifying imagery to describe the sovereign power created through the social contract. So in the state of nature where no authority exists, justice and injustice are meaningless concepts. Every individual has the right to everything, and thus nothing can be unjust, and to avoid death, we form a government. And if you were to take anything away from this video about Hobbes, it would be that the main practical conclusion of his political philosophy is that the state or society cannot be secure unless at the hands of an absolute sovereignty. And that brings us to the end of this video, and thank you for watching. And please let me know in the comments if you have any questions about Hobbes' philosophy, and let me know whether you agree or disagree with him. And don't forget to like and subscribe as always.